Hello, and welcome to Invisible Empires. The steel smelled of rain and coal dust. August 1st, 1914, Newcastle upon Tyne. The River Tyne churned dark beneath a sky the color of lead, and along its banks, the shipyards of Armstrong Whitworth stretched like the ribcage of some mechanical god. This was the beating heart of empire, the place where nations purchased their power in tons of riveted iron and the promise of destruction. And moored in the fitting-out basin, massive and silent as a threat, sat two ships that had cost more than most countries' annual budgets, the Rashadi and the Sultan Osman I, two dreadnought battleships, the most advanced instruments of naval warfare ever constructed. They belonged to the Ottoman Empire, or they were supposed to. By nightfall, that would change. By nightfall, an act of theft disguised as policy would set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the entire Middle East, draw artificial lines across ancient lands, and ignite conflicts that still burn a century later. This is not a story about strategy. This is a story about betrayal, and its consequences are written in the borders of every nation, from Syria to Iraq, in the blood of millions, and in the ruins of a world order that never recovered. The Rashadi stretched 560 feet from bow to stern. Her hull displaced over 22,000 tons. 10 massive 13.5-inch guns rose from her deck in 5 twin turrets, each capable of hurling a shell weighing over 1,200 pounds across 13 miles of open ocean. She was beautiful in the way that weapons of absolute power are beautiful, sleek, purposeful, terrifying. The Sultan Osman I was even more devastating, nearly 670 feet long, armed with 14 12-inch guns, more heavy artillery than any battleship in existence. Together, these two vessels represented the rebirth of Ottoman naval power, a declaration to the world that the empire once called the sick man of Europe was not dying, it was arming itself. And standing on the wet docks beneath these steel mountains were 500 men who had traveled 3,000 miles to claim them. They wore the red fez with black tassels. Their uniforms were crisp despite the English drizzle. Their faces carried the dignified determination of men who knew they were part of history. For months, they had been living aboard a cramped transport vessel in Newcastle Harbor, waiting, learning the hydraulic systems that elevated those massive gun turrets, memorizing the intricate network of steam turbines and boilers, training in the cold rain of northern England while dreaming of the Bosphorus. They were the elite of the Ottoman Navy, hand-picked sons of an empire that spanned 3 continents, and they had come to take their ships home. Captain Rauf Bey, their commander, stood at the dockside with the final payment receipt in his hand. 4 million British pounds, paid in full. The ceremony was scheduled for 8 a.m. on August 2nd. The Turkish flag would be raised. The ships would steam east toward the Mediterranean, through the Strait of Gibraltar, across to Istanbul. Within weeks, they would alter the balance of power in the entire region. The Greeks knew it, the Russians feared it, and the British were not going to let it happen. What those 500 sailors didn't know, what Captain Rauf Bey couldn't have known, was that their ships had already been stolen. 24 hours earlier, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, had made a decision. A cold, calculated decision dressed in the language of national security, but executed with the ruthlessness of piracy. On July 31st, 1914, Churchill ordered the Royal Navy to seize both battleships. No negotiation, no warning, no compensation offered. British soldiers from the Sherwood Foresters Regiment boarded the vessels. Ottoman naval personnel were barred from approaching. The ceremony scheduled for the next morning would never happen. When Captain Rauf Bey arrived at the appointed hour, he was met not with the ships his nation had purchased, but with a curt message from the British government. The vessels had been requisitioned. For the security of Great Britain, the matter was closed. Imagine it. You have paid every penny. Your nation has scraped together 4 million pounds, an astronomical sum equivalent to over 400 million pounds today. The money came from everywhere, from school children donating their lunch money, from widows selling jewelry, from entire villages pooling their savings. The Ottoman Navy League had launched a nationwide campaign: donate to the fleet, restore our pride, protect our shores. Medals were given to those who contributed. Women sold their wedding gold. Men donated months of salary. Across the empire, from Damascus to Baghdad, from Berth to Anatolia, ordinary people believed they were buying back their dignity. They called the Reshadiye our dear Reshadiye. The ships were not just weapons, they were symbols, proof that the Ottoman Empire could still command respect, that after the humiliations of the Balkan Wars, where the Greek navy had crushed them at Ely and Lemnos, they could rebuild, that they mattered. And now, less than an hour before those ships were to become theirs, a foreign power had simply taken them, kept them, renamed them. The Reshadiye became HMS Erin. The Sultan Osman I became HMS Agincourt. They would sail under the British flag, fight in British battles, serve British interests. And the Ottoman Empire could do nothing about it. The news reached Istanbul like a thunderclap. Rage swept through the streets. Newspapers printed furious editorials. One wrote, "This is a blow delivered not just to our government, but to the millions of our people who sacrificed from their families' food budgets, from their children's mouths, to contribute to these ships." The sense of betrayal was visceral, personal. It wasn't just that Britain had seized military assets. It was that Britain had stolen something purchased with the pennies of peasants, the savings of shopkeepers, the dreams of an entire population. The Ottoman Navy League had created a powerful myth that the ships were paid for by the people, for the people. Recent scholarship has revealed the truth was more complicated. The ships were actually financed largely through loans from British, French, and German banks. The public donations, while real and emotionally significant, covered only a fraction of the cost. But here's what matters. The Ottoman public believed they had paid for those ships. And belief is more powerful than fact when it comes to shaping history. The myth trapped the Ottoman leadership. They couldn't sell the ships or negotiate them away because the people thought they owned them. And when Britain seized them, it wasn't experienced as a policy decision. It was experienced as robbery. Churchill would later defend his action in characteristically bold language. He claimed it was essential for British security. That, with war looming against Germany, Britain needed every battleship it could get. That, allowing two state-of-the-art dreadnoughts to sail to a nation increasingly aligned with Germany, would be strategic suicide. And from a cold realpolitik perspective, he was right. The Ottoman Empire had been drifting toward Germany for years. German officers trained the Ottoman army. German diplomats courted Ottoman officials. On July 27, 1914, 4 days before Churchill seized the ships, the Ottoman Empire and Germany had begun negotiating a secret alliance. It would be signed on August 2nd. The same day, the Ottomans were supposed to take possession of their battleships. So Churchill's defenders argue he was simply recognizing reality. The Ottomans were going to side with Germany anyway. Better to keep the ships than hand them to a future enemy. But this argument ignores a crucial truth. The seizure didn't just reflect existing tensions, it created new ones. It inflamed them. It took a population that might have been divided about entering the war and united them in fury. The Young Turks who controlled the Ottoman government, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, Jamal Pasha, had their own reasons for wanting a German alliance. They admired German military efficiency. They feared Russian expansion. They hoped a victorious Germany would help them reclaim lost territories. But the broader Ottoman public was far from united. Many favored neutrality. The Sultan himself advocated staying out of the war. The Ottoman Navy had traditionally been pro-British. Senior naval officers argued for maintaining good relations with Britain and France. But the seizure of the ships shattered those arguments. How could you argue for trusting Britain when Britain had just committed what felt like an act of war? How could you advocate neutrality when a supposedly friendly power had stolen vessels paid for with national sacrifice? The humiliation was total. And humiliation is a weapon more powerful than any battleship. Germany saw the opportunity. On August 10th, 1914, 9 days after the British seizure, two German warships appeared at the mouth of the Dardanelles, the battle cruiser SMS Goeben and the light cruiser SMS Breslau. They had been chased across the Mediterranean by British and French fleets and were seeking refuge. The Ottoman government, still officially neutral, let them through. And then Germany made a brilliant move. They sold both ships to the Ottoman Empire, a gift to replace the stolen vessels. The Goeben became the Yavuz Sultan Selim. The Breslau became the Midilli. German crews donned the fez and became Ottoman sailors. It was a transparent fiction. Everyone knew the ships were still German. The officers followed orders from Berlin, not Istanbul. But it didn't matter. The symbolism was perfect. Britain steals your ships. Germany gives you ships. Britain humiliates you. Germany respects you. On October 29th, 1914, those Ottoman ships, under German command and without authorization from most of the Ottoman cabinet, bombarded Russian ports on the Black Sea. It was an act of war. Russia, Britain, and France declared war on the Ottoman Empire on November 4th. The Ottomans were in the war, on Germany's side, and the Middle East would never be the same. Because once the Ottoman Empire entered the war, it stopped being a regional power and became a target for partition. The moment Ottoman Turkey joined the Central Powers, the Allied powers began drawing up plans to carve it into pieces. In November 1915, two men sat down in a room in London. Sir Mark Sykes, representing Britain. François-Georges Picot, representing France. Their assignment: decide how to divide the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire once the Allies won the war. For 6 months, they negotiated, drew lines on maps, assigned territories, created spheres of influence. The result was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, signed in May 1916. It was a secret treaty, a plan to partition the Middle East between European powers with no input from the people who actually lived there. France would get Syria and Lebanon. Britain would get Iraq and Palestine. Russia would get parts of Armenia and Kurdistan. The agreement promised the Arabs their own states in certain areas, but in practice, those promises were vague and contradictable. The British had also made contradictory promises to the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, implying support for a unified Arab kingdom. And in 1917, they would issue the Balfour Declaration, promising to support a Jewish homeland in Palestine. 3 different promises, 3 incompatible visions, all built on the assumption that the Ottoman Empire would collapse and the victors could redraw the map however they wanted. And collapse it did. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was defeated. Its armies shattered, its territories occupied. The empire that had existed for over 6 centuries was dying. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 and the Conference of San Remo in 1920, the Allied powers formalized their plans. The Middle East was divided into League of Nations mandates. Britain took control of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. France took Syria and Lebanon. The borders drawn were artificial. They split ethnic groups, divided religious communities, ignored historical boundaries and tribal territories. The Kurds, promised their own state, were instead scattered across Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. The Sunni and Shia populations of Iraq were forced into a single state despite deep sectarian divisions. Palestine was promised as a homeland for Jews while also being home to a predominantly Arab population. Syria and Lebanon were created as separate entities to serve French interests, dividing populations that had never been divided before. These weren't nations being born, they were territories being assigned. And the violence that would flow from these decisions would define the region for the next 100 years. Trace it back. Trace the line from those 2 stolen battleships in Newcastle to the trenches of Gallipoli, where Allied forces suffered over 285,000 casualties trying to force the Dardanelles, to the Armenian genocide, where over 1 million Armenians were killed during the chaos of the war, to the Arab Revolt, where British officers like T.E. Lawrence made promises of independence that would be betrayed. To the creation of Iraq, a state cobbled together from 3 Ottoman provinces with different ethnic and religious compositions, ruled first by a British-installed king and destined for decades of coups, dictatorships, and wars. To the partition of Palestine, which created Israel in 1948 and displaced hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, beginning a conflict that still rages, to Syria and Lebanon, where French colonial policies exacerbated sectarian tensions that would explode into civil wars, to the rise of Arab nationalism, which sought to undo the artificial borders and unite the Arab world, only to fail repeatedly, to the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf Wars, the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, which explicitly vowed to end Sykes-Picot and erase the borders drawn by colonial powers. Every line on the map, every contested border, every sectarian conflict, every war over oil, over territory, over identity, you can trace them back to decisions made in London and Paris between 1914 and 1920, and those decisions were made possible because the Ottoman Empire entered World War I, and the Ottoman Empire entered the war in part because of the rage and humiliation caused by Britain's seizure of 2 battleships. Could it have been different? Historians debate this endlessly. Some argue the Ottoman-German alliance was inevitable, that the Young Turks were already committed, that the seizure of the ships was irrelevant to the larger strategic picture. They point out that the secret alliance with Germany was signed on the very day the Ottomans were supposed to receive their battleships, suggesting the decision was already made. And they're not entirely wrong. The geopolitical currents were strong. Ottoman fears of Russia, German military prestige, British and French condescension toward the sick man of Europe. These forces were real, but other historians point to the contingency of history, to the fact that the Ottoman cabinet was deeply divided, that many ministers only learned about the decision to enter the war when German-commanded Ottoman ships bombarded Russia, that Enver Pasha, the most pro-German of the leaders, reportedly placed his pistol on the table during a cabinet meeting to end debate about the war decision, that the Ottoman public was not enthusiastically pro-war until the seizure of the ships created a wave of anti-British sentiment that drowned out the voices of caution. What if Britain had not seized the ships? What if they had paid compensation immediately? What if they had negotiated a deal, leased the ships for the duration of the war, returned them afterward with interest? What if Churchill had calculated that keeping Turkey neutral was worth more than 2 battleships? We'll never know. But we do know what happened. And what happened was a decision made in a moment of imperial arrogance that helped trigger a chain reaction lasting more than a century. Churchill himself would live to see some of the consequences. He would watch the Middle East burn through 2 world wars and the beginning of the Cold War. He would see the State of Israel created and the First Arab-Israeli War. He would see British influence in the region crumble. He would see the Iranian oil nationalization crisis and the Suez Crisis. He never publicly expressed regret about seizing the Ottoman battleships. In his memoirs, he wrote about it matter-of-factly, a military necessity, a strategic imperative. The cost was worth paying, but the cost wasn't paid by him. It was paid by the millions who died in the Ottoman collapse, by the Armenians massacred, by the soldiers who fell at Gallipoli, by the Arabs promised independence and given mandates, by the Palestinians displaced, by the Iraqis who suffered through coups and dictatorships and wars, by the Syrians torn apart by civil conflict, by the Lebanese caught between sectarian factions, by the Kurds denied a homeland, by every person who has lived and died in the Middle East, shaped by borders drawn by men who didn't live there, didn't understand it, and didn't particularly care what happened after the maps were signed. The HMS Erin and HMS Agincourt served in the British Grand Fleet for the duration of World War I. The Erin participated in the Battle of Jutland, though she never fired her main guns in that engagement. The Agincourt did fire, unleashing her 14 massive guns in the largest battleship clash in history. After the war, both ships were scrapped to comply with arms limitation treaties. They were cut apart for metal, melted down, disappeared, as if they had never existed, but their theft lived on. In the borders of nations, in the fault lines of conflicts, in the collective memory of humiliation and betrayal that shaped how generations of Middle Easterners viewed the West. When ISIS declared its goal of erasing Sykes-Picot and creating a new caliphate, they were reaching back to a moment a century old. When Arab nationalists spoke of Western imperialism and broken promises, they were remembering 1916 and 1920, and the mandates that felt like colonialism with a new name. When Kurds fought for autonomy in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, they were living the consequences of borders drawn without their consent. When Palestinians and Israelis confronted each other over land both claimed as rightfully theirs, they were inheriting a conflict born from contradictory British promises and the partition of Ottoman territories. There's a photograph from August 1914. It's grainy, black and white, faded with age. It shows the Sultan Osman I at dock in Newcastle. British sailors are visible on deck. In the foreground, barely visible, are Ottoman sailors. They're standing on the pier, looking up at the ship they came to claim. Their postures suggest confusion, disbelief. They can't board. The ship that was purchased with their nation's treasure, that was supposed to restore their navy's pride, that represented their future, it's right there, 50 feet away, and they can't touch it. That photograph captures a moment, but it also captures something larger. The moment when a great power decided that its security was more important than another nation's sovereignty, when strategic calculation overrode contractual obligation, when might made right, regardless of the law or basic decency. The Ottoman sailors in that photograph would go home empty-handed. Many of them would die in the war that followed, fighting on the losing side, watching their empire die, and then watching as foreign powers carved up their homeland according to interests those sailors had no voice in shaping. Today, if you look at a map of the Middle East, you're looking at the ghost of that decision. The borders between Iraq and Syria artificially straight in places, cutting across natural, geographic, and ethnic boundaries, those are Sykes-Picot borders. The division of Lebanon from Syria, a French decision to create a Christian majority state that would be friendly to French interests that came from the mandate system born out of Ottoman collapse. The problems of Iraq, a nation that includes Kurdish North, Sunni Center, and Shia South, three groups with different languages, cultures, and religious practices forced into one state. Those problems were baked in from the beginning, when British officials drew lines on maps in 1920. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict born from the impossible promise of giving the same land to two different peoples, the Balfour Declaration and the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, making contradictory commitments that conflict traces directly back to British decisions made during and after World War I. The Syrian Civil War, the rise and fall of ISIS, the sectarian violence in Iraq, the recurring crises in Lebanon, none of these conflicts can be reduced to a single cause. They're complex, driven by local actors, regional rivalries, global power politics, economic factors, religious divisions, and 1,000 other variables. But they all unfold on a map drawn by outsiders, in states created by foreign powers, within borders that never made organic sense. And it all started, not entirely, but significantly, with a decision to steal 2 battleships. Not because the ships themselves were so important. HMS Erin and HMS Agincourt were powerful, but they weren't war-winning weapons. Britain's Grand Fleet was already the largest in the world. 2 more battleships made little difference to the overall balance of power. The real impact was psychological, political. The seizure enraged a population. It destroyed trust. It united disparate groups in shared humiliation. It gave Germany a propaganda gift. It pushed a wavering empire toward a disastrous decision. And once that empire entered the war and lost, it created the vacuum into which European powers rushed to impose their vision of how the Middle East should be organized, a vision that served European interests, that secured oil supplies and trade routes and strategic bases, that divided potential rivals and created client states. That promised the moon to multiple groups and delivered chaos. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was supposed to be secret, but in 1917, after the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks published it. Suddenly, the whole world could see the cynicism. The Arabs, who had been promised independence, saw that Britain and France had already agreed to divide their lands. The shock was profound. T.E. Lawrence, who had worked with the Arab Revolt, was appalled when he learned the full extent of British duplicity. He felt he had been used to deceive people who trusted him. In his memoir, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he wrote with bitter irony about the contradictions between what he promised the Arabs and what his government intended. But by then, it was too late. The Ottoman Empire was defeated. Its sultan was a figurehead. The Turkish heartland would become the Republic of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who fought off foreign occupation and created a modern, secular nation-state. But the Arab provinces, they became mandates, colonies in everything but name. And when those mandates eventually became independent nations in the 1,940 seconds, 50 seconds, and 60 seconds, they inherited borders that made no sense, governments that lacked legitimacy, populations divided against themselves, and the legacy of broken promises and foreign domination that would fuel anti-Western sentiment for generations. In 2006, when sectarian violence in Iraq reached horrifying levels after the US.S. invasion, some commentators declared the end of Sykes-Picot. They argued that the artificial state of Iraq was finally coming apart along its natural fault lines. In 2014, when ISIS erased parts of the Syria-Iraq border and declared a caliphate, their propaganda videos explicitly celebrated the end of Sykes-Picot. The message was clear. We are undoing what the colonial powers did to us a century ago. We are erasing their borders and their betrayals. Of course, ISIS's vision was horrific. Their caliphate was a nightmare of brutal violence and oppression. But the fact that they could gain support by invoking colonial betrayal shows how deep the wound goes. How a decision made in 1916 still shapes the politics and conflicts of 2014. That's the true cost of Churchill's seizure. Not the £4 million, not even the 2 battleships themselves. The cost was trust. The cost was the path not taken a Middle East where the Ottoman Empire might have stayed neutral, where the post-war settlement might have been negotiated rather than imposed, where borders might have reflected the actual composition and desires of local populations rather than the strategic interests of distant powers. We can't know if that alternative history would have been better. Maybe the forces of nationalism, sectarian division, and great power competition would have torn the region apart anyway. Maybe the discovery of oil would have made conflict inevitable regardless of who drew the borders. Maybe the collapse of empire was going to be violent and messy no matter what. But we do know what actually happened. And what happened started with theft. With a powerful nation deciding that its needs trumped another nation's rights, with a moment of imperial arrogance that helped trigger a war that killed millions and reshaped the world, with 2 battleships that never sailed under the flag they were built for, with 500 sailors standing on a dock, staring at ships they would never board. With a humiliation that fed rage, that fed alliance, that fed war, that fed collapse, that fed partition, that fed conflict that continues to this day. The next time you see news from the Middle East, another bombing in Baghdad, another crisis in Syria, another flare-up in Israeli-Palestinian tensions, another Kurdish independence movement, another sectarian massacre in Lebanon, remember the lines on the map. Remember who drew them. Remember when they were drawn, and remember that the map was drawn in the wreckage of an empire that entered a war it didn't have to fight. A war it entered, in part, because a great power stole 2 ships. This is not to say Britain is to blame for every problem in the Middle East. That would be absurd. 100 years of history involves countless decisions by countless actors. Local leaders made terrible choices. Regional powers pursued destructive policies. Global superpowers used the region as a chessboard for Cold War rivalries. Oil created wealth and conflict. Religious extremism took root. Authoritarian governments oppressed their people. Sectarian hatred was cultivated and weaponized. All of these factors matter. But they all played out on a board set up in 1916 to 1920, in states created by outsiders, along borders drawn to serve foreign interests, within a framework of broken promises and imposed order. And that framework, that Sykes-Picot, and Sykes-Picot was possible because the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and that collapse was hastened by Ottoman entry into World War I, and that entry was driven by many factors, but among them was a theft, a betrayal, a humiliation. 2 battleships stolen in Newcastle on August 1st, 1914. Today, those ships are gone, scrapped nearly a century ago. But their theft echoes in the straight-line borders between Iraq and Syria that cut across tribal territories, in the divided Kurdistan that spans 4 nations, in the artificial state structures that never achieved stable legitimacy, in the sectarian violence that erupts again and again, in the collective memory of peoples who remember being promised freedom and given foreign masters, in the anti-Western sentiment that shapes politics from Tehran to Bairth, in the extremist movements that invoke colonial betrayal to recruit supporters, in the refugees fleeing wars that trace back to borders imposed without their consent. The theft of 2 battleships didn't cause all of this, but it was a link in a chain, a moment when history pivoted, when a different choice might have led to a different path. Churchill made a calculation. He weighed the value of 2 ships against the risk of letting them go to a potential enemy. He chose to seize them. He chose British security over Ottoman sovereignty. He chose to betray a contractual agreement because he had the power to do so. And the Middle East is still living with the consequences, still fighting over borders drawn in the wreckage, still dealing with states that never quite worked, still bearing the weight of promises made and broken a century ago. This is how empires fall, not all at once, but in cascading consequences. One theft leads to one war, leads to one collapse, leads to one partition, leads to 100 years of conflict, and the men who make those initial decisions, Churchill at his desk in the Admiralty, Sykes and Picot drawing lines on a map, diplomats making contradictory promises to Arabs and Jews and Kurds, they don't live to see the full cost. They see the immediate benefit, the strategic advantage, the ships added to the fleet, the territories secured, the mandates assigned. What they don't see is the child who will die in a sectarian massacre in Iraq in 2006, the family that will flee the Syrian civil war in 2015, the Palestinian refugee whose grandparents were displaced in 1948, the Kurdish fighter who will die fighting for a homeland promised and denied, the Lebanese civilian caught in crossfire between factions created by colonial divide and rule, the Iraqi soldier who will fight in 3 different wars over oil and borders and power. They don't see those people because those people are 100 years away. They're abstract, future costs of present decisions, but they're real, and they're living right now. In a Middle East still haunted by theft committed in 1914 and partition imposed in 1920, in a region still trying to escape the shadow of empires that drew its borders and made its problems and then left. The battleships are gone. The Ottoman Empire is gone. The British Empire is gone. But the consequences remain, written in borders, carved in conflict, alive in the blood and memory of a region that never forgot the theft that started the collapse.